Somewhere in Babylon, about 3,000 years ago, a man works all day so that he can see for 1 hour after dark. That is not a figure of speech. Economists have actually tried to calculate this, to measure not what light cost, but what it cost in human life and hours of labor traded away. The answer for a Babylonian burning sesame oil in a small clay lamp is staggering. To buy the amount of light a modern bulb throws off in a single hour, he would have had to work for something on the order of 50 hours. More than a week of daylight labor converted into 1 hour of a small orange flame that guttered, smoked, and smelled faintly of dinner. Now consider your own lamp. At an average wage, the electricity to run it for an hour costs you less than a second of work. Less than the time it took you to read the sentence. Between that man and you lies one of the strangest facts about our species. The price of light has fallen by something like a factor of 500,000. Not 50%. Not tenfold. 500,000? If bread had followed the same path, a loaf would cost less than a grain of sand, and we would have long since stopped charging for it. This is the sort of fact that belongs in a book of wonders, and it is wonderful. But it is not, by itself, the story I want to tell. Because the interesting thing about cheap light was never the light. The interesting thing was what people did once the sun stopped being the boss. They read after dinner. They studied at night, which meant that people who worked during the day could become educated, which meant that education stopped being a luxury of the leisured. They opened factories that ran in shifts around the clock, which changed what a working life felt like. They built cities that glowed from orbit. They pushed sleep later and shortened it. They made the night, which for every previous generation of humans had been a dangerous, useless, mostly indoor void, into the most socially productive part of the day for an enormous number of people. None of that is a fact about lamps. All of it is a fact about us. Ask a room full of people to name the greatest invention in history, and you will get a reliable list. The wheel, the printing press, penicillin, the internet. Sometimes fire from someone feeling contrarian. It is a fun question. It is also, I want to argue, almost the wrong question, wrong in a way that quietly distorts how we understand our past and badly misleads us about our future. Here is the problem. Greatest invention lists rank objects. They reward the impressive thing, the machine that gleams, the moment of genius, the man in the workshop at 2 a.m. But history is not rearranged by objects. It is rearranged by what becomes possible when an object gets cheap enough that ordinary people build their lives around it. Consider 2 machines. The first is the Concorde. It flew at twice the speed of sound, and it was beautiful. A white dart with a drooping nose, cruising at the edge of space where you could see the curvature of the Earth through the little windows. It crossed the Atlantic in under 3.5 hours. It is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most magnificent things human beings have ever built, and it flew paying passengers for 27 years. Now name one thing about the world that is different because it existed. It's hard. The Concorde was an extraordinary object that changed almost nothing because it never got cheap. A seat cost roughly what a small car cost. A few thousand people at a time, bankers, diplomats, rock stars, arrived in London slightly less tired. The rest of us went on flying subsonic, and when the last Concorde landed in 2003, the world did not have to rearrange itself even slightly to accommodate its absence. The second machine is a corrugated steel box. In April of 1956, a former truck driver named Malcolm McLean loaded 58 metal boxes onto a converted tanker in Newark, New Jersey, and sent them to Houston. There was nothing clever about the boxes. They were boxes. They had no moving parts, no engine, no patent worth stealing. Nobody wrote a magazine profile about the genius of the rectangle. But here is what happened to the price of moving things. Before McLean, loading a ship meant gangs of dockworkers, manhandling barrels, crates, and sacks into a hold, item by item, in an intricate 3-dimensional puzzle that took days and cost by one careful accounting. Around $6 a ton. Loading McLean's boxes cost about 16 cents. Not 6% cheaper. Roughly 97% cheaper. And so, factories in Asia, because it stopped mattering where a thing was made. Container ports the size of small cities, and the death of the old working waterfronts of Brooklyn and London and San Francisco period. Strawberries in February. A phone in your pocket whose components crossed 4 oceans before they met. The entire physical architecture of the modern economy, the reason a shirt costs less than the lunch you eat while shopping for it, rests substantially on a dumb steel box that no one would ever put on a list of the greatest inventions in history. The Concorde was the better machine. The box was the greater technology. That gap between the two is what this book is about. So let me offer a replacement for the wrong question. Instead of what was the greatest invention, ask what got cheap and what fell apart because of it. Disruption, in the sense I mean it throughout this book, happens in 2 steps, and almost everyone pays attention only to the first. Step 1. Something that used to be scarce becomes abundant. Light. Copies. Force. Distance. Calories. Calculation. Step 2. Every arrangement of human beings that was built on that thing being scarce comes apart. Step 2 is where the history is. Because scarcity is never just a shortage, it is a source of power. Wherever something valuable is hard to get, someone stands in the doorway. There are guilds around scarce skills, priesthoods around scarce texts, aristocracies around scarce force, professions around scarce knowledge. These are not conspiracies. They are the perfectly sensible structures a society grows in order to manage something precious. But they are load-bearing walls built on a price, and when the price collapses, so do they. Take the printing press, which does deserve its place on everyone's list, but not for the reason usually given. Before Gutenberg, a book was an object of astonishing labor. A good manuscript Bible represented a year or more of a trained scribe's life, and could cost as much as a house. That price did something to European society that had nothing to do with reading speed. It meant that texts lived in a small number of protected rooms, in a language most people could not read, in the custody of an institution that also claimed the exclusive right to say what they meant. If you wanted to know what Scripture said, you asked a man whose authority rested, in part, on the fact that you could not simply check. Then copies got cheap and the wall came down. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther produced a list of grievances, 95 of them in Latin, aimed at a fairly technical dispute about church fundraising. It was not designed to be a bestseller. Within a matter of weeks, it had been translated, printed, reprinted, and carried the length of Germany by printers who had discovered something new about the world. That controversy sells. Luther became, almost by accident, the first mass media celebrity in history. The church had faced reformers before and had absorbed or destroyed all of them. It could not absorb this one, because it was no longer arguing with a monk. It was arguing with the printing industry. Nothing about ink was theologically dangerous. What was dangerous was that an entire architecture of interpretive authority had been quietly resting on the cost of a book, and the cost of a book had just fallen through the floor. Notice that this is not a story about the quality of printed pages. Early printed books were, by the standards of the great manuscript workshops, rather ugly. That was irrelevant. It is almost always irrelevant. Which brings us to the second reason we misjudge technologies. At the moment of arrival, a disruptive technology usually looks like a slightly worse version of what we already have. The first printed books imitated manuscripts so faithfully that buyers sometimes could not tell the difference. The type was cut to mimic a scribe's handwriting. The initials were painted in by hand afterward. Printers were not trying to invent a new medium. They were trying to make the old one faster. The first automobiles were slower, louder, less reliable, and far more likely to strand you in the mud than a horse, which had the further advantage of knowing the way home. Britain's response was a law requiring a man to walk ahead of the vehicle carrying a red flag. This sounds absurd now. At the time, it was reasonable, because at the time, the car was an inferior horse. The first electric motors were bolted into factories exactly where the steam engine had been, driving the same overhead shafts and leather belts, and delivering only a modest improvement. It took decades, and it is the subject of the next chapter, for anyone to realize that the real gift of the electric motor was not that it was a better engine. It was that you could put a small one inside every machine, which meant you could arrange your factory around the work instead of around the drive shaft, which meant the assembly line, which meant the 20th century. This is the pattern, and once you see it, you will see it everywhere. The first use of a new technology is to do the old thing more cheaply. The disruption arrives later, when somebody asks a question that would have been nonsense before. Nobody invented the elevator in order to change the social geography of the city. Elevators, platforms hauled up by ropes, are ancient. What Elisha Otis added at a New York exhibition in 1854 was a brake, a mechanism that caught the platform if the rope snapped. He demonstrated it by standing on a hoisted platform in front of a crowd and having an assistant cut the rope with an axe. The platform dropped a few inches and stopped. All safe, gentlemen? That brake made vertical travel routine, and routine vertical travel did something nobody asked for. For all of previous urban history, the top floor of a building was the worst address in it. A long climb, reserved for servants, students, and the poor. Within a couple of generations, the top floor became the best address in the building, with the best light and the best view, and a name of its own. We call it the penthouse. It was, in a real sense, invented by a brake. I should say plainly, here at the start, that cheap is not a synonym for good. This book is full of wonders, and I intend to let them be wonderful. There is real awe in the fact that we pull fertilizer out of thin air, that we can read the genetic text of a living thing for the price of a dinner, that a species which once worked a week for an hour of firelight now lights entire coastlines by accident. But the logic of cheapening is morally blind, and it does not only produce good outcomes. It produces consequences, and the consequences land on people. Cheap ocean crossings gave us the exchange of the world's crops and cuisines. They also gave us the slave ships, which were an economic proposition before they were anything else. Cheap coal gave us the escape from the energy ceiling that had capped every previous civilization, and it gave us a changed atmosphere. Cheap nitrogen fertilizer feeds, by the most common estimate, something close to half of everyone alive. And the same chemistry, in the same decade, in some of the same factories, made the explosives for the worst war the world had yet seen. And in every case, somebody paid the bill personally. That is why nearly every chapter in this book begins with a person standing on the losing side of a price collapse. The scribe whose beautiful trade became a hobby. The knight whose armor and lifetime of training were undone by a farm boy with a gun. The switchboard operator, the longshoreman, the travel agent. They were not stupid or lazy or resistant to progress. They had built a life on the reasonable assumption that something difficult would stay difficult. It is worth remembering how that felt from the inside, because the odds are decent that at some point in your life, it will be your turn. So this is the method, and I will use it on everything from the control of fire to the machines now learning to write and reason. For any technology, ask 3 questions. What did it make cheap? Not what does it do? What did it collapse the price of? Sometimes the answer is unexpected. The washing machine made cheap something that never had a price tag at all. A woman's Monday. Who was organized around that thing being expensive? This tells you who will resist, who will lose, and what institutions are about to feel unstable for reasons they will describe using other words. What becomes thinkable that was previously absurd? This is the hardest question, and the only one that predicts anything. The answer is rarely the improved version of the old thing. It is usually some new behavior that would have sounded ridiculous a generation earlier, like a stranger sleeping in your spare room for money, or a city where the rich live at the top. We are, right now, in the middle of at least one of these transitions, and possibly several at once. And I would suggest gently that the public conversation about it is making the same mistake it has made every time before. We are arguing about the quality of the object. We are asking whether a machine can really write a poem, whether it truly understands, whether its pictures are as good as a person's. In 1450, the equivalent argument was whether printed letters were as lovely as a scribe's. The scribes had an excellent case. They were also, in the only sense that mattered, discussing the wrong thing entirely, because the question was never about the letters. The question was about what happens to a world in which anyone can be copied. The chapters that follow are a long answer to that question, asked 18 or 20 times across 3 million years, in every place where something precious became ordinary. Let's begin where every one of these stories begins, with a fire that somebody, at last, learned to keep.